So welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm going to adjust this microphone real quick. We're here with Ben Marcus, whose latest book collection of stories called Leaving the Sea just came out in paperback. And I'm sort of an awkward interlocutor, so I'm just going to sort of throw sentences at him and ask him to respond to them in no particular order for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to take any questions you have. So Ben, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming.
I suppose, I guess to start out, I think of this collection as it covers a lot of ground stylistically. Some that is closer to what one is more familiar with from your earlier work, and some that's sort of this new, more conventionally realist form, but still has your fingerprints all over it. And I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Well, the book collects stories, I think, from about 12 or 13 years of writing. There are only a few pieces, or maybe two, that are that old, and a lot of them are really new. I'd finished a novel, and I was going to put out a collection of stories, and I had enough. I had the pile. The pile was high enough, but the problem was that some of those things in the pile were really terrible. When I reread them, I just felt sad, and it's hard to look through a lot of things you've written and see how limited it is. It was like sort of looking at a bunch of pictures of myself, on the rings. I just kept doing my same trick. The thing, I got my legs up and put them off to the side and dismounted. I was like, hey. And so I think it was good to look at it all and think, yeah, there's lots of other things that could be there, and why aren't they? And it wasn't as though a book of stories has to be some big democratic stew of here's all the nice ways there are to write a story. But I think what the problem was that, to me, it didn't reflect what I was really interested in and what I really cared about. And I realized I just hadn't written a certain kind of maybe more straightforward stories for me that were a chance to reach as deep as I could inside somebody's body and bring out the stuff that really mattered about it, what it was like to really be a person. I feel like I'd written a lot of stories that were about the ways words can rub together and make us feel really funny. And so I wanted to, I guess, do what I hadn't done. And so I did write stories that were more straightforward and maybe more about just the psychology of the characters. And I think for a long time I had anxiety about those kinds of stories, even though I always loved to read them. I think when I was in college, I was reading people like Richard Ford and Ann Beattie and Jane Ann Phillips and Deborah Eisenberg, and alongside people like Donald Barthelme and Natalie Sarraute and Beckett and Borges. To me, I was happily ignorant enough not to think you couldn't really. I didn't realize there were big, kind of fully outfitted military differences between these two ways to write. I really didn't. I didn't understand that the realists hated the experimentalists, or whatever they're called, and that the experimentalists denied the actual physical existence of the realists. None of those wars meant anything to me.
Right.
And it was a nice.
When did they acquire their meanings?
It's like the War of 2002, maybe. That's a good question. I went to graduate school at Brown in 1989, and I didn't really know what I was getting into at all. And we were talking about a little bit about this earlier, but one of the first things I saw from another student was someone was just like, well, so in my work, I want to invent a new letter of the alphabet. And the 27th letter, I'm going to deploy it and change all the words of the whole language. And there was a lot of this kind of conceptual invention. Writing was like visual art in that way. You would look at it and think, what hasn't been done? And how can I come along and do something totally new and totally unheard of? And in that world, too, there was a lot of scorn towards conventional writing, because if something had been done before, why were people continuing to do it over and over and over again? And so I became a lot more aware of that at that point.
What at the time, I mean, you mentioned this is when you're coming into Brown. What kind of work did you apply with? Was it more on that realist side of things, or more on the?
I was resorting to bribes. I was bribing the
It's a good move.
editions. I had like the writing itself was sort of secondary, monetary bribes. It's, if I showed you what I was writing then, you'd throw your mic down and leave. You'd walk out.
Well,
I was trying my best. It was pretty lyrical, probably a little bit strange, pretty unshaped, unformed, not quite stories. They might have been a little sentimental.
So this wasn't what became Wire and String.
Oh, no.
Wire and String.
No,
Okay.
No. Right. Yeah, although I guess that happened about a year later.
About a year later.
Yeah.
Was there a thing? Was there some kind of influence that turned you in that direction, or was it just you found yourself doing it, or?
It's a good question. I was really interested in Borges, the Argentinian writer, who some of what he did was to sort of write what I think of as fake nonfiction. Seems like an essay, seems like a dictionary entry, but it's completely made up. So what attracted me was this really authoritative voice. Like if you open an encyclopedia and read it, there's something so seductive about it. It's whatever is being discussed. It's usually, or for me anyway, outside of my field of learning. But because of the way it's being presented, the rhetoric, the language, it feels true. And so I think that I was messing around with that a little bit, like fake certainty, and because I thought the real problem for the fiction writer was being believed. Because fiction is made up, and who cares if it's made up? How can it matter? And so I was really, I think, obsessed with believability. And at the time, believability was this kind of authoritative voice. In other words, fake definitions. And so I was sitting in the library with encyclopedias and rewriting little pieces of them. And I think one of the things I did that started out the Age of Wire and String was I would start to read an encyclopedia entry and make myself stop and sort of close my eyes and keep writing in my head and try to make it more interesting. Sort of I was trying to entertain myself. Like, wouldn't it be funnier actually if we just made some changes here? And so it was a little bit about reading that book. It was about realizing sometimes when I read, I would close the book and kind of keep reading in my head. And it took a little while to realize, like, oh no, that's actually not reading, that's writing. But it may be how I sort of slid into doing that. And at the same time, I was trying just to write more straightforwardly, but it really was just so bad that I knew not even to show it to anyone. It just didn't, it had no muscle or energy or vitality. And I think I really just wanted to do something I hadn't seen before, as foolish in a way as that is in retrospect.
Well, see, because what's interesting to me when you're talking about this sort of encyclopedia voice, so that does seem really apparent in Wire and String, and it seemed also like there was something else going on that I think is happening in some of the later stories in Leaving the Sea. I don't know, not later in terms of when they're written, but the book, for those of you who haven't read it, is in 6 sections, and so maybe around from the father costume and the next section, where, for me at least, what ends up happening is you're doing this really authoritative voice, and you're using nouns that are familiar nouns in very unfamiliar ways to mean things that sometimes just they don't mean in the regular world, and sometimes our brains can construct things around them. Like there's something called a costume gun, right? And we can, I think that evokes a lot of images probably for a lot of people, certainly for me. But one thing that's kind of that it seems to continue to happen and seem to happen in Wire and String too is that the word, in one sense, that you use a word like, maybe it's costume gun or costume over here, and one gets the sense of it being symbolic for something. And then as the piece goes on, that actually changes sort of radically and often paradoxically. Like a costume can't mean what we thought it meant before. and I wonder, like, I'm certain that that's deliberate, and I wonder what the intended effect of that is. It's because it's
Yeah.
a fascinating thing. It's
It's hard to sort of. I wrote that book like 800 years ago, and it's hard to really, I guess, now pretend I at all knew what I was doing.
Yeah.
I do think, in some ways, even now, but especially then, when I wrote, I just wanted to feel something very specific, and it was a kind of unsettled, uncanny feeling. I think I was after the feeling of a sort of strangeness that can arise when you look at something very normal, or it almost connects back to like being really young and just looking out a window and at a tree and thinking that just a tree itself was such a strange thing that there would be in the world. In other words, a really elemental, maybe estranged relationship just to the very facts that we all are constantly taking for granted. So sort of stepping back from the very basic things we live in and realizing how kind of alarming it all is. And so I think when I was writing, if I could get myself to feel that way about really normal things, then I was sort of happy. It was
Gotcha.
Because I couldn't, I didn't really know what the drug was that would make me feel that way. There really just wasn't, and so in some ways, writing was this effort to just make myself feel that way. And it's, I guess, making the meaning of words unstable was something I did a lot. I would, but it seemed like it didn't always work either. It seemed like it was too easy for it to be a little silly, a little bit word gamey, and so there was a lot of trial and error. And I think throughout it all, I really wanted there to be a lot of feeling in it. Like it had to. I didn't want it to seem like, well, he's just another untrained scientist, kind of just fooling around.
Well, that's what I think is pretty remarkable about those works in both cases. Is that they have, when I see people try to imitate them, for instance, I'll have students sometimes who will, or just some
during
writers
the annual imitation.
during the Ben Marcus Imitation Festival.
Yeah.
No, but the thing is, like, they have all this potential to go really bad, and they don't. And like it seems like there's a risk on one hand of some of those stories reading like the sort of stream of consciousness of someone who's experiencing psychosis. They never do. Or on the other hand, like,
that is what the New York Times said about that book.
Is that so?
Yeah, it was really brutally dismissed as. You're
they're
actually
silly.
like quoting from
Is that so?
Did you write that review?
No. But I'm saying like it's like it doesn't do that. There are these sort of traps when I see like. It's that, and the other one is that it would feel like a Mad Lib kind of thing, and it really never does. It really does have the effect of destabilizing these nouns, these facts in the world. And
I used to think about it a little bit, or sort of joke to myself that what I did was English as a foreign language, like, because it was in English, but there was something. It felt almost like you couldn't quite. It was like you could recognize the words, and in a way they made sense, but that there was this level of incomprehension. But in a way, putting it that way, it doesn't make that sound like such a hard thing to do.
Well, it seems pretty hard to me. I mean, when I'm thinking of the story Origins of the Family, right? And there's this word, the word bones keeps getting used. And at first you think it's bones, and this is and there's, I think there's a body is, I can't remember the line now, of course, but at various points bones can't be what they are in this world, and at various points they can. And when they aren't being what they can be, there's something that is, or at least we would imagine there is something that bones evoke. There are hard things, there are protective things, and it sort of makes me think when I'm reading some of these pieces that the world that I imagine is some slightly future or parallel universe that had our English 100 years ago, and that slanged it out into something else. But
that's a nice way to put it. It's hard to say that there was a lot of calculation other than a lot of revision designed to kind of, for me, hit the right register of something that felt a little unsettled, but not just random, not obscure. I think for a long time when I wrote, I thought that I wasn't just, I made this kind of mistake that I wasn't just writing, but that like if I if I had a character walk through a door, that I actually had to plant a seed and grow the tree and then harvest the tree and have the door built. That like things couldn't just exist. Like they had to all be sourced.
Sure.
And that was this bizarre burden. Like I couldn't just use things as we all understood them as, you know, and in some ways though, it pushed me into a different way of thinking about objects and materials. And maybe that's partly connected to that.
That's interesting. I know that sort of that kind of feeling of responsibility you're talking about. It is very burdensome.
Well,
it's
that's
like
why
you don't want to be
yeah.
random at any cost. And
But with some of those stories, it was a very deliberate effort in this book to just leave all that behind. And you know, when I was able to just say, you know, then he left his house and went to work, it was such a relief because in the past, I literally would have to like hire people to like build the factory where this person's car was, you know, getting like you couldn't just do that. Like it was like some kind of cheating. But obviously that has its limitations, and so it is sometimes really nice to just play with the received language we all know and understand. And it took me a long time to realize that actually you can get at some of those similar sensations that way too, with language that's just really functional, hiding in plain sight.
When you certainly do it in here, and and I think that has to do, maybe it's what you started out talking about, where we're getting at more sort of interior human stuff, but there's also something structurally with a lot of the stories where you're withholding certain kinds of information. And it's very interesting. You withhold information, for instance, in the story.
What have you
the
done?
loyalty protocol.
Oh, yeah.
The loyalty protocol.
Probably in
Okay,
all of them.
so it's this. There's a whole lot of tension around some great apocalyptic event coming.
Yeah.
Right. And there's all this other stuff going on with the story. The story ends up being about this man and his parents and loyalty. And but through this whole thing, it seems that the world is mostly ours, that and either this guy is part of sort of a cult or like a community-wide alertness, paranoid faction kind of thing.
Wrong.
Yeah. But so as it's proceeding, we're expecting to find out what they fear, what the great apocalyptic thing they fear is. It creates tension, a lot of tension. We don't ever find out what it is. The story still ends up being quite satisfying, and so I think there's something there to you're also leaving out some of the stuff that in most other cases and with most other writers would obviously be put in, if not focused on, and it creates a different kind of tension with the stories that makes them their own strange thing.
Oh, thanks. I think a lot about what you can hold back in order to, I guess, just to make people be more interested. You know, you and I both teach. I've been teaching since I was, you know, like 21 or 22. I'm 47. I pretty much without a break, even on the weekends, do a little teaching. So every day, I don't know how many days that is. I don't know if there are any people good at math, but so seeing a lot of, let's say, student short stories and having discussions with other students about how these stories could be better, which sort of sounds kind of simple, but of course is not. And one of the most common things one student says to another about a story that is pretty terrible, but could be good. I mean, it's not terrible for where the student is in their life or whatever, but one of the most common things people say is, I want to know more about this character. You know, they just...
More of the mother.
They want to know, they want more information. And what we've sort of started to do in at least some of my classes is actually just think, okay, let's pretend we know where this character went to school and where they work and what they're wearing and what they look like, and we actually provide all this information. And nearly every time you discover, well, you've satisfied someone's curiosity and you've completely killed the story. Like, we do want to know these things, but it's not really the writer's job to give that information. I think it's like the writer's job. This sounds like such a terrible way to start a sentence.
Tell us about the writer's job.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you what the writer's job is. That's actually a secret. But I like to think of maintaining the curiosity. In other words, like, how do you keep people curious? And obviously some readers are just like, fuck it. This is so annoying. I want to know what's going on, and he's playing a game, and I do get that reaction, and I mean, and by which I mean I understand that reaction. But I guess I like to think, like, how do we stay curious when we read? I put a lot of books down if I don't have to read it for work or something.
Sure.
I just don't finish a lot of fiction. I'm 10 pages in, 20 pages in. I'll be 5 pages from the end.
Right.
And I'll just think I will die if I have to finish this book.
You've really put it down with 5 to go?
5 words from the end.
Which book? Give me a 5-word.
The Bible.
Oh, all right, fair enough.
No,
the last 5 of the words, they suck, the last 5 words. It's a good
it's not
move.
clear what is the end of the Bible.
Yeah,
What is that? What's that last page?
That's in another language. I don't
Can you
know.
quote it? It's all right,
John.
I'm just testing you there.
I
I guess it's just like in the loyalty protocol. I think I did establish this mystery, and it's a gamble if you don't ever really share it. But the idea was then to, I guess it was almost like using soundtrack, like the way in a movie, a little bit of music suddenly accomplishes so much feeling. And what is the equivalent in writing? Like, how do you make something feel a little ominous, a little unsettling? And obviously there's lots of little things you can do, but I guess I did find that I've done versions of these stories where more is revealed and they're just never better. And so at least for me, giving away all these facts doesn't seem to count as something dramatic. And I always think, well, how to make it more dramatic, how to make people care more, how to make people feel like they can't put it down. And so at least with some of those stories, leaving things out was a kind of way, part of a way to do that.
Sure. It works pretty great. I wonder if you could talk a little about difficulty in general, and also specifically as it is in Leaving the Sea, which I think has an arc of difficulty. Where it's very easy to enter, and then we get to the middle, and that's the dense stuff. And then when we come out the other end, it seems like there's some sort of synthesis of these kind of 2 or maybe 3 modes of writing.
Yeah, so difficulty. It's such an interesting thing. I mean, I imagine most people here read books, but most people in the world sort of don't. And if you read 1 book a year, there's going to be a certain kind of literary language that actually just seems a little complicated, sort of, because it's not the language we use when we speak to each other. It's artificial. It's a construct. It's got a set of principles. There's a certain way that even the most basic storytelling is actually, it takes a little attention. And I think when I was younger, I mean, I just was a relentless reader, just for pleasure, just really read everything. And as I wrote, I think I sort of more naturally just was, absorbing what I was reading and writing back at it a little bit in ways that probably got more and more complicated. And in a way, when I wrote The Age of Wire and String, it didn't occur to me that was a difficult or even really hard to read book. Yeah, I was just completely naive. I think that it looked that, like, because I could read it, and I wasn't really thinking, oh well, if for someone who really doesn't read, it's going to look crazy or like a foreign language.
Sure.
And so I wasn't deliberately doing that. Or for me, the goal wasn't, I'm going to write something that all my relatives can't understand.
Right.
And they're going to be so uncomfortable.
But
gatherings.
you didn't have the sense you were writing something for people who loved to read, or like, because that sort of the difference you mentioned at the beginning.
Another way to put it might be is I didn't really have the ability to think that there was anyone else in the world other than me. This was something that
that's fair.
I was 20 or whatever, and I didn't have to take care of any pets or people, and I just I had a lucky young adulthood, but I very, very quickly was really beaten over the head with the difficulty of that book, the unintelligibility of it, the nonsense of it. I mean, I got the feedback I got was 90% negative. Like if you look at the reviews of that book,
Yeah.
they were so dismissive and almost angry. But there was no one saying, that means you're good, kid. It was just like,
Really?
yeah, not at the time.
Huh.
There was a lot of like 5 years later, 10 years later appreciation. But so I did get this message that with like that, what I did was kind of hostile.
Huh.
It wasn't just minor and obscure, but also hostile. And so in a lot of ways, it just really made me think about connecting and communicating and what that was and how to do it in a way that still resonated with the way I wanted to write and all those things. I mean, yeah, there was a fairly hostile reaction to that. And so
did you get any like sort of good juice out of the hostility though? Like,
no,
there was no like, I am such a bad, like I am punk rock. Like I've scared you people. Like there was no.
No, I think even if I get some praise, I read some negative intonation, into it. So no, it didn't feel good at all. It didn't feel good at all. There was no real way to, but it didn't really make me feel badly about what I'd written. It just made me realize, oh, this will be for like 11 people and not 5,000 or 10,000 or whatever. So it was more just, I still am glad I wrote it. I was surprised that it would look so unintelligible. And so I don't know, I think about this a lot. I think that if you read night and day and you write a lot, it's sort of natural if you evolve a kind of style that is probably better appreciated by other people who at least have read some books. Now, if you say that, it sounds really elitist. It's if you say, well, I write, but you shouldn't read it if you don't read.
Yeah.
But the criteria for all this are sort of strange. And I remember at the time, like I was friends with some writers and they wrote kind of like, even by their own admission, pretty mainstream, transparent novels. But you'd go on Amazon and people were like, I couldn't understand this at all. This is Greek. Yeah. And so you realize like, oh, that the criteria for difficulty really vary. And we're in a very weird world where we can't extrapolate out. You very quickly become too immersed in reading and writing to be any kind of good judge of this.
Sure.
So I don't know. So I'm interested in forms that are really accepted, like a form of a short story that is a really accepted way to storytell, to make fiction.
Yeah.
And think, well, what is it to work within that? But at the same time, when I finished this book, I kind of went back and did something that was. Now I kind of know, like if I'm really trying to invent new uses for language and messing with parts of speech and taking it apart a little bit and trying to make something, I don't think, this is going to be in the New Yorker or, I don't have any illusions about it, but I still like it and it still interests me and I still want to work in these ways that I like. But at the same time, I can't help noticing when there are like 10 people who like something versus 1,000.
Sure.
So yeah, this book wasn't an attempt to like do things at different registers of difficulty, but like when I was in my 20s and writing Age of Wire and String, I had a lot of like angry young guy things of being really dismissive of a certain way of writing fiction, a certain more traditional way. I was really dismissive of anything remotely autobiographical. I thought it was a huge weakness to reveal anything at all about yourself in fiction. I had a lot of these, I guess, criteria. It was a criteria heavy time.
Yeah.
Right? I knew what was good and I knew what was bad. It was just, the sad thing about that phase of life is how certain one can feel. I haven't felt that certain in a really long time.
I think maybe it comes from some sort of need to like, when you're a young writer, because I had the same thing is like, I feel like the older I get, the more open I am to things that I completely would have dismissed and pretty much along the same criteria. Like autobiographical things were poison, like it's bad funny, to me.
And so, so I decided to, I was talking about this with a painter friend actually at the time, and we were both sort of saying like, oh, like look at all the things you thought you'd never do or you thought were stupid or, you'd written off and do them all now and just see. And for a lot of those like criteria I had, I just couldn't even really remember what it was I was resisting.
Sure.
And I think it took me a long time to realize, like, well, just because you write, let's say, a third person close interior narrative about some lonely dude, like, it doesn't mean you give up everything that's you as a writer. And so I think it just took me a while to realize that I might still sound like me, and that it would still be my story, even if I was using maybe more of a received mode, just to try it. And so part of this book is an attempt to just kind of go back, and I'm sort of still doing this because, you know, you run out of stuff to do. I don't know if you do. I do. Or I just think, you know, I'm not like a factory. I can't just churn out stuff. And so sometimes I just think, like, what am I interested in the least? Like, when I look out at everything published, like, what genre or like approach is just the biggest, snooziest bore, kind of face-crushingly terrible thing to do? I'm doing that next.
Right. Well, I'm saying that's what I think.
Well, let me just finish though. It's because, like, I don't know how to do it. I probably don't understand it. I don't understand what its pleasures are. I'm going to be a rookie at it, which means, like, if I feel like a rookie, I'm going to have to learn everything all over again. And I like that feeling of vulnerability. Like what's hard is if you feel like you know how to do what you're doing. That's, for me, that's when the trouble starts.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think that's one of the sort of payoffs for having those ridiculous criteria when you're younger, is that no, really, it's that you close yourself off. I think at the time, probably closing yourself off to a lot of things makes you sharpen up in the one little area that you think is okay. Because I feel like that's how I remember. So that
well, I mean, I hope so. I had a group of friends, and, you know, we'd go out carousing, harming ourselves with you know, toxins, and they would be like, it's only DeLillo and the rest is shit. Unless it's DeLillo, it's shit.
Yeah.
I may have said that. I don't even think I particularly liked DeLillo then.
I have a DeLillo question for you, actually. That's
you know, so I don't know.
There's I think there's in that moment or in that time period, it seems like there's a zillion ways to be uncool. And that those all have to be avoided first, and then you can figure out what.
Oh, I thought you were going to say it's exhausting to be them all.
Well, that's what it. Yeah, I could say that too. But DeLillo. Speaking of DeLillo,
yes,
there are these. The story that I brought up before, actually, the loyalty protocol. In that section of the book, there are these two stories, and they're the two that to me seem to signal like that they're an influence, an extra textual thing more than some other stuff, and so I don't know if I'm making it up or not, but it seemed like the first one was nodding to the stranger a bit. And
which
I haven't.
Story is that the loyalty protocol?
No. Watching Mysteries with My Mother.
Oh, okay.
And which I loved, which I think like sort of pulled me through it by the hair more intensely than most of the rest of the collection. Not that the other ones didn't, but there was something. The momentum of that story was really huge for me, and yet nothing like happens.
Right.
That's sort of what gets left out. There's this thing that would maybe happen, a number of things that would maybe happen that don't. But the whole time you're sort of in this man's head.
So that's a story about this. It's just essentially a guy who's left his mother at home, and she's aging, and he's just thinking about her imminent death and what he's really should be doing about it. And it was I actually wrote that after writing some what I thought of as super plot heavy stories. I just thought, okay, I'm sick of having stuff happen.
Yeah. And that was that. Yeah. I mean, there's so much tension in the story, and there's also some really funny bits about mystery shows on television in it. They watch mystery shows together, and sort of it kind of ruins mystery shows for you on television. It's like every. It
does provide the secret to solving all plots.
All the keys to all mystery shows exist in this story, where this guy is worried about his mom.
I should have called it spoiler.
That was a spoiler what I just gave, or
no, just
they're spoilers.
Called the story spoiler.
Yeah, spoiler. Yeah. But so that one seemed to have something to maybe do with The Stranger, which I haven't read in years and years and years and years, and maybe only half read. And the one after, the Loyalty Protocol, seemed like it evoked this white noise bit, quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always happy to be influenced by something, and this must happen to you. People ask you what your influences
Sure,
are.
of course.
With watching Mysteries with my mother, I think when I look at it now, like I don't really, I don't ever sit down and think, now I'm going to be influenced by this
Of course
thing
not.
and I'm going to enact it. But I think it's the opening line or two that are most sort of Camus-like, because I think the opening line of that story is, I don't think my mother will die today.
Yes.
Or something like that. And that is obviously, but
there's a riff on the word "the stranger" like a few paragraphs later
is that
too, which
right?
I was like, that's.
Well, it's funny because I think had I been aware of that at the time, it probably would have kept me from ever writing it. In other words, there is that kind of anxiety of influence that you can feel, which maybe stops you from doing stuff that will kind of overlap with this stuff that has moved you. But to me, I must have had some defense up from thinking it. So that I could get it written, and then I just get to deal with the accusations later. No, but do you know what I mean? Like
I do.
I remember just what I was I wrote that story in like 3 days, and I really just wanted it to be a character thinking through all the ways in which he's responsible for his mother's death. But if he's not with her, is he adding to her loneliness? And if you add to someone's loneliness, are you sort of an accomplice to their it's like, and to be honest, I actually do remember feeling an influence to that story, and it was maybe the first time I allowed myself to be a little more influenced by Lydia Davis's stuff, whose stories I like. But to me, I saw that as a really cerebral, kind of methodical account of thinking. And that's a really good way to describe the stories she writes. A lot of them. They're really just documents of thought.
Absolutely.
And so I felt that as an influence. And in fact, even remember thinking, that maybe this is too close. As opposed to The Stranger, which in retrospect is really obvious, given that line. But so
Lydia Davis, that's because
I don't know.
Yeah. I think Bernhard too. I mean, but that's sort of like broad stuff. Like the thing that's interesting to me, and it definitely happens to me, which is I suppose what I'm asking you is the way that influences end up kind of creeping in. And I don't think influences are bad. I think they're there. They're actually unavoidable. You write in traditions, whether you want to be or not, to some degree. Is that if maybe you sit down, especially when you say you wrote the thing in 3 days, is if you're sitting down and working and you're sort of you're caught up, and then maybe midway through you go, oh, there's this other thing that has been informing this, and you go back and you go, I have to write a paragraph about the word "the stranger" now, but apparently not.
I mean, I just didn't. I must have just had some way of protecting myself from that realization. I'm not trying to say it's not there. I really just didn't think of it that carefully.
Sure.
But I remember thinking, well, when I was in graduate school, we read this French poet, Francis Ponge.
Okay.
He's an amazing poet. And there's some Ponge quote that some poet mafia crowd was always saying. I think the quote is, we can only write what we've already read. In other words, whatever we're writing is just some product of what we've read. And so my really kind of caveman response to that at the time was, all right, if I'm totally just doomed to that, I'm just going to read some stuff that no one else is reading. Right? So I'm going to read like developmental guides to like troubled 5-year-olds. Like educational texts for teachers in training. And so I really did think, okay, I have to actually mix that in with reading the fiction I liked and the history and the philosophy. And so I really very deliberately was always trying to read in particular texts that weren't fiction, but also texts that weren't really written to entertain at all.
Manuals.
Yeah, stuff like that. So, as to the DeLillo thing with Loyalty Protocol, it's totally there. I will say though, like my characters all just are huge disasters. they're just a huge mess. They're all fucked up and miserable, and they hate each other. And DeLillo seems like so kind of cool and calm, and no one really misbehaves in DeLillo. Like they're all kind of on point. They all have self-control, and I don't think any of my characters have any self-control at all.
Very anxious characters. They're I mean, do you want to say something about that? Like that's because I was reading, I was trying to figure out how to formulate a question about their sort of anxiety and their sense of alienation. I think I was
I mean, I guess like once I started to think, okay, another big facet of fiction is just to listen in on characters' thoughts. Anxiety is just so entertaining. Yeah. And I do feel like it's rare to find a person who can't relate to it. Like
same with sense of alienation. I mean,
like if there's anyone who bills themselves as not being worried about stuff or anxious about stuff, you just don't even want to spend time with them. It's like it almost seems as though they don't know how to even think about the fact that they're going to die and that bad stuff's going to happen and that it's going to hurt when they wake up. They're going to have a pain but like the people who are just like, no, I feel great. What are you kidding me? Like it's almost just there's just like a huge block of meat with like a tiny pea brain, like a dinosaur brain. So like anxiety seems almost just like such a natural mode and so interesting and and so but I do tend to kind of produce levels of it in fiction that seem almost unbearable. I guess that's just wanting to concentrate it. And, like The Moors is obviously, the last story in the book is really a pretty deep, relentless attempt to just see what happens if you just turn anxiety up all the way. And, and what does it sound like? And
I mean, what's fascinating with that story and going back to what you were saying about reading other stuff, like, that story and a couple others, there are these radical mood shifts, and they're taking place when we're very close to the protagonist. Either in I think, well, in third person in all cases except for the there's not a radical mood shift in the mother story, but there are these radical mood shifts, and it's sort of it pleases the inner B.F. Skinner in me, like, deeply, because there's a thing that happens where especially in the Moors, where you have this man presented. It's most of it. It's about 60 pages, something like that, and about 55 of them or so, like. It's a guy walking down a hallway behind.
Don't give away the plot.
It takes place.
It's like the most boring story.
It's amazing. It's the opposite of the most boring story ever. It should be the most boring story ever.
It's about a guy waiting in line. Seriously,
to get coffee, and in the course of that, he comes across as a pretty despicable guy, like on a number of levels, and like he's very entertainingly despicable. But it's creepy when you feel a moment of relation to him because you're like, oh wait, I don't want to be like this person. And then there's this radical mood shift at the end where we see him outside of the confines. I won't ruin it, but we see him in a very different context, and he's a very believably different person who reads completely human and
it's kind of an overtly redeeming moment.
Yeah, except somehow it doesn't. That usually is going to feel false, and it just doesn't. It feels really. I feel like I'm reading about the same person in two different contexts and really just hours apart. And I think that's something that's not often taken on, at least not that great a contrast in fiction. And it's pretty remarkable. And I'm wondering if that was where. Yeah,
well, I thought of the ending the whole time writing that story, but I have this guy in line, and I couldn't get the line to move. This was sort of like a mechanical problem. Like I needed to hire somebody to move the clock. See, I moved it back. It's like I didn't know how to advance time. It was really this problem, and so I was stuck in his head, and I felt like, okay, well, I have to make a plot out of his thoughts. And but I would wonder. I have heard that he's despicable and all that, but I guess the larger question is, like, if you're just sitting and having a casual conversation like this one, and while having that conversation, you're imagining really unspeakable, terrible things, but then you kind of know, Jesus Christ, like
Right.
that's I would never do that. Like, how despicable are you?
Well, I think that's yeah.
So, you know, I think I just, yeah, he really, his mind goes into all these bad places and then he kind of retreats, but he hasn't done anything. And so I guess I did think, yeah, he's a super bad thought criminal for sure. Like if he did any of these things, he would just be locked up. But I don't know, you know, I'm sort of on the fence about his.
No, I'm with you on that. I think that the characters that I end up experiencing as most kind of despicable are the ones where I have these sort of touch points with, where I go, yeah, like I've had really dark, messed up thoughts that are sort of like these guys, but I make myself forget that I've had them. And so when I see.
It would be really good if we could see an accurate statistical accounting of what kind of criminals we are. Like just or just like how much criminal activity we entertain or violent activity we just entertain. We just entertain it, and we're really I think lucky because we're probably we're among the last few generations to live without some kind of, I don't know. This is going to sound too spooky if I talk about like cognitive surveillance.
No, I'm with you. Yeah.
You know, it's GQ just asked if I wanted to write a piece about the advances in mind control that are.
You doing it?
I don't think so.
I want to read about it. I want to
Too lazy.
I think I'm being.
No, but we do take for granted. I think we're very, very at ease with the fact that, you know, we could just be hang out with people and imagine all kinds of weird things we would do to them or have them do to us or do with them against the third person.
Sure.
And it's all just fine. I don't know.
Maybe
I personally don't do it.
No, but you wonder if in that if we were to reach some time where we could be internally surveilled in a very deep way, if you just end up learning how to box it in more.
Yeah.
If there's a deeper level. I'm getting signaled that we're supposed to take questions.
1984.
1984. I just got signaled internally actually.
Thought
I didn't know that was there. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, questions.
Start with the first row, I guess.
Hi.
So this anxiety, fear, criminality, did you read Dostoevsky too much?
Can you read him too much? You know, I read Dostoevsky so much that I just felt, I felt for quite a long time, why bother? I really did. I felt it in a very genuine way that I would never even remotely approach that kind of depth. I would never make another person as scared and as spoken to as, well, Crime and Punishment did for me. But sure, you know, it's, I'm glad he's dead. He's like not as much of a threat.
It's true.
Day to day, you don't feel like fucking what's he gonna be coming out with? But yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Could you say a few words about the title story? The
Leaving the Sea.
first sentence goes on for 5 pages, and there's a lot of sensations and feelings that I had, but I felt myself getting anxious without any white space and paragraph breaks
Yeah,
and
I'm
punctuation.
sorry about that.
So
You know, it's the kind of thing I would never do now. I think it has a self-consciousness in that technique that I feel like I filled up on, and you know, I feel like I probably could have written that in normal sentences, or you know, put it through a filter online that'll break it up into sentences and punctuate it for me. But it's good that it's short. And you know, I made it the title story because there is a phrase in which the narrator is thinking about how everything that has gone wrong for humanity went wrong as soon as we as a species left the sea. And I think at the time of putting this book together, I liked that the title, if you tell it to someone leaving the sea, it just sounds so safe and friendly. It sounds like, you know, well, we were sailing for a while on a beautiful sailing trip, and then we came back home. I like that actually when you get to that phrase in the middle of the book, it looks like maybe a sort of upsetting indictment of more or less all human activity since we started to breathe. which I felt like I should go big. Hi.
Hi. First of all, I've never read anything you wrote, so sorry.
It's okay.
My husband.
I haven't read your stuff either.
So, but just listening to you brought back a visit to the Art Institute to see the Magritte exhibit, and you know how he makes the everyday bizarre. And I had my 2 grandchildren with me. She's 8, he's 13. She's looking at the derbied guy looking through a keyhole at a floating head, and he comes behind her and says, "You are now in the Beyond department of Bed Bath and Beyond."
That's really nice.
So that made me think of you know,
better
what
than
you were
anything I
saying
could
about you know, where we are in our heads and
You know, it's funny because, when I was in college, I loved looking at Magritte's pictures. And another artist I think of right alongside him is the Italian futurist Giorgio de Chirico, who was sort of less overtly surrealist. Do you know his stuff? It's really just these kinds of ominous classical structures, but in these like deep saturated colors, and there might be like a shadowy figure in the background. And I think about that feeling as really formative to me.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry, I couldn't see you up there.
Hi.
Hi.
Who is writing today that you wish were dead?
I would start with Adam, Mr. Adam Levin here. Still working on that. Only have a little more time with him today before I have to get my car. That's a good question. You know, I just saw that there's a novel coming out by Kazuo Ishiguro, who's a British novelist who I think at his best is really, he's kind of disabling to me because he's got just tremendous control, serious, let's say, realist ability, but is also capable of reaching this really mysterious, transportive level. And he works invention in a way that's really sophisticated. Like it just, when I read him, like The Unconsoled would be an example, and even the novel Never Let Me Go, I feel like he does something with omission that I just
Never Let Me Go for sure.
I just bow down to. Unconsoled also. And then J.M. Coetzee, also the South African writer, his last book, The Childhood of Jesus, I thought was just kind of a masterpiece, a really, really disturbing book. And those would be 2. You know, as of today, they were alive. See?
Maybe tomorrow.
Never know. There's an app, you know.
Writer Deadpool.
Yeah. That's a good question, though. I don't know. I don't really want these people to die. Who do you want to die?
I don't want anyone to.
Really? You're gonna take that angle now? You're gonna take the high ground after I just said all of that? You're stranding me.
I mean,
I'm not saying you have to like do anything about it.
I don't know. I could just sort of, if I state it publicly.
You could even say, if I were the kind of
If I were the kind of guy.
All right. Caveat.
Who wanted.
Forget it.
Yeah. No, I
don't even
can't.
care. I lost.
He has a much colder heart than mine.
Can I bring the mic to you?
The kind of writer who wishes I was dead.
Never mind.
Wait, I'm not sure I get it. Yeah, I thought that's what we were talking about.
No, you.
Oh, you were asking the reverse. Yeah, I thought so too.
Oh,
You read them that you wish. Oh, I can't write anymore. I just might as well.
He wants you to
be dead.
talk some rot, man. Who do you hate? That's what he's.
oh yeah, I don't know. No,
They write so well that you. can say-
that's what I was answering.
Right. But instead of them you wishing they were dead, I can't write anymore. I wish I just might as well. Be dead.
Oh,
You know, you could
oh,
answer
yeah.
it that way.
Oh, I don't know. You know, I have to survive until my kids get to college. I make their sandwiches. I buy their clothing. I have responsibilities, so I have to survive.
That's you. So
I'm
you're not gonna let anyone make you wish you were dead.
No. No, I don't know. You know, honestly, I don't read a lot of new fiction. I think I get a little. I like to kind of have a little ignorance, and it gives me maybe allows me probably to be influenced a little more easily, or I don't know. Do you keep up a lot with the fiction that comes out?
Actually, I think I do. I think more. Less lately. Lately, I spent a long time deliberately not reading anything that wasn't written in English, for reasons that make no sense to me now. And so I've been trying to catch up on that. But mostly when I read American stuff, I read contemporary stuff. I think, of course, everything drops away when you try to come up with names. But
Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if you studied with Robert Coover or John Hawkes if you were at Brown, because a lot of what you see reminds me of John Hawkes.
Well, Coover, absolutely. I got to Brown right when Hawkes retired, and so my experience of him was great and amazing, but never in the classroom. He was often a dinner guest at Coover's house, where he was really funny and weird and crazy. And I think he thought I might have just been like a butler or like a waiter who was like was being allowed to sit at the table, who just sort of stared at him and drooled. But I worship Hawkes, and yeah, Coover, I mean, honestly, was really my one and only real teacher. Incredibly generous and smart. And, at the time I didn't realize this, but he was one of the few teachers that I've kind of seen out there who didn't sort of he try to coerce his students into a certain thing, didn't sort of impose an aesthetic on them, really looked at what they were doing and what they most wanted to do and just tried to help them. But also just, for me, I still want to model myself after him because he's stayed generous and would do anything for his students and has always, I don't know, he opened a lot of doors for me, has always been so supportive and so kind of just large-hearted. And interestingly, Coover's, he's 81 and was just published for the first time in the New Yorker 2 years ago.
Those are the first stories? Was the Going for a Beer? Was
that the very first time he's ever been published there? And but anyway, there's really no meaning to that statement, but he's writing some of the best stories of his life in his 80s. And he's just somebody who's never stopped and is always trying to reinvent himself and do things he hasn't done. But yeah, so Coover was an amazing teacher, made graduate school what it was for me.
Great. Well, that concludes our session for today. I do want to remind you that the book signings will take place outside of the performance hall in the lobby area. So we hope you'll go down and visit us there. Our next program in this room will be at 4:30.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody.